Ever since the 1950s, our food supply has progressively become more processed. This means that the food is essentially more refined, and the value, that is the nutritional value of the food, is actually significantly more impoverished. For the most part, the effect of processing really stabilizes the food for a long shelf life, and the only way to do that is to really render the food extremely poor in quality. And consequently, we're left with an impoverished food supply and an inability, for the most part, to understand what foods are actually nutritious and what foods aren't. So we need to be more judicious about the kinds of food that we shop for and the kinds of food we bring back to the home base to feed our children and to feed ourselves. So we are left with multicolored, synthetic-looking foods that are high in taste sensation, that look good, that taste really good, but for the most part are really not good for us. So in this particular set of lectures, we're going to discern what exactly we need to be looking for on the nutrition facts panels. So I want to take a look at the nutrition facts panel. This is actually the old nutrition facts panel, but what we have at the top are the number of calories in the cereal itself, and then another column for the calories with the milk added. Then we have calories from fat. Then we have total fat, and the total fat is broken down into its various components. Then we have cholesterol and sodium, and we see that sodium at 160 milligrams is 7%. And we see also the dietary fiber at 8%. That's 2 grams. What do these percentages actually mean? Well, here's a way to look at the significance of these particular percentages. So if the nutrient contains 20% or more of the daily value, it's considered an excellent source of that nutrient. If it's between 10 and 19, it's a good source. If it's between 5 and 10, it's not a good source. And in fact, if it's 5% or less, it's actually considered a poor source. So look at the vitamin A at 10%, that's a good source of vitamin A. Calcium at 10%, that's a good source. Iron at 25%, that's an excellent source. Folic acid at 50%, that's an excellent source as well. Right? If we look at the fiber at 8%, it's actually a good source of fiber. So I've selected a set of breakfast cereals from which you'll be able to practice your understanding of how the nutrition facts panels work. So let's take a look at All Bran Buds from Kellogg's, and let's take a look at the yellow label at the front. The yellow label tells us that there's 17 grams of fiber, which represents 61% of the daily value for fiber. So it's an excellent source of fiber. This claim on the front of the breakfast cereal is actually called a content claim. It's providing the consumer with information regarding the content, but it is not making in itself a health claim. One thing we see with the new nutrition facts panel is that the calories and the serving size are much bolder, more visible to the consumer. Let's take a look at the content. So total fat at 2% of the daily value, that's 1.5 grams, can be considered in the following way. First, because it's less than 5%, we can say that it's low in fat. And also according to the guidelines for labeling by the FDA, because it's less than 3 grams of fat, we can say that it's actually low in fat. Let's drop down a little bit, go down to sodium at 300 milligrams, 13% of the daily value. What exactly does this mean? Well, this is what it means. If the daily value for sodium is 2,400 milligrams, and if 300 milligrams is found in one serving, what percent of the DV does that represent? Well, it's 300 divided by 2,400 times 100. Gives you 12.5%, and the FDA rounds it up to 13%. So the DV for sodium is a good one to remember. Let's take a look at dietary fiber. At 17 grams, let's see how they come up with 61% of the daily value. Here's how the calculation works. The daily value for fiber is 28 grams. It's up from the old nutrition facts panel, which was at 25 grams. So now under the new facts panel, we have a higher requirement for fiber, 28. So if one serving is 17 grams, then what's the percent of the daily value? Well, it's 17 divided by 28 times 100, which is 60.7%, or roughly 61%, as indicated on the food label. This makes it an excellent source because it's greater than 20% of the daily value. Well, what about total sugar? Well, as you saw in the textbook, there's no official governmental cutoff for total sugar, but there is one for added sugar. It's 10% of the calories. Since the food facts panel is based on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, we can actually calculate what the daily value is for added sugar. Now, let's take a look at what the daily value is for sugar. It's 10% of the DRI calories. So the Nutrition Facts panel is based on 2,000 calories. So the added sugar daily value is really equal to 10% of 2,000 calories. So that's 0.10 times 2,000. And we divide that by 4 calories per gram because we're talking about sugar, of course, which is a carbohydrate. That gives us a daily value of 50 grams per day. So if the label states that there are 12 grams, what's the daily value? 12 divided by 50 times 100, which equals 24%. Let's do one more example using some of the micronutrients that are featured here on the label. So let's use calcium as an example. We could see here that the content without the milk is 30 milligrams, and it represents 2% of the daily value. Let's see how that calculation is done. Well, first, the daily value for calcium is 1,300 milligrams. So if one serving is 30 milligram, then what is the percent of the DV? Well, it's 30 milligrams divided by 1,300 milligrams times 100. You get 2.3%, and the FDA rounds it to 2%. On the Nutrition Facts panel, there is also a set of ingredients that are really not good for you. And so the understanding is that you want to kind of keep these as low as possible. Total fat, for instance, is okay, but you don't want to be consuming too much total fat. Saturated fat, trans fat, the same thing, cholesterol, sodium, and of course total sugar. So using the percent cutoffs that we saw previously to indicate that a source is high or good, for instance, we will use in this context of ingredients that aren't so good for you to express what is high, what is moderately high. So then ingredients such as saturated fat, and total sugar that are considered high in the Nutrition Facts panel are those ingredients that have a content for which that represents 20% or more of the daily value. In the same way, ingredients that we're not really supposed to be taking high concentrations of, that attain 10% all the way up to 19% of the daily value, these ones are considered moderately high. Now, an ingredient for which the concentrations are greater than 5 all the way up to 9.9% of the daily value is considered a healthy concentration. This would apply particularly for things like fat, because of course we do need to have some fat in the diet, but we don't want the fat to be high. We want it to be at a healthy concentration. So that would be greater than 5 all the way up to 9.9%. So now let's take a look at Cascadian Farm Raisin Bran, and let's look at the feature on the front, and we could see that we have a content claim claiming that there's 21 grams of whole grain and that there's 7 grams of fiber. So this is a content claim, not a health claim. As we look at total fat at 1.5 grams, we could see that that represents 2% of the daily value. You remember that an ingredient that is 5% or less is considered low. So for total fat, this would be an appropriate, if you will, categorization for someone wanting to have a low fat, but you could still have a healthy fat intake if you were greater than 5% but less than 10%. And then, of course, moderately high, 10% to 19%, and high for 20% or higher. Now I want to drop down to carbohydrates, looking specifically at total sugar and added sugar. Now we know that added sugar, as previously indicated earlier in this video, has a limit of 10% of the DRI calories. But for total sugar, the FDA has no specific standard, but in the textbook itself, I teach that NIH data supports the idea that we should be aiming for less than 20% of the DRI calories. So in looking at total sugar at 16 grams, we would be able to assess whether this product is high in sugar, moderately high in sugar, at a healthy level of sugar, or actually low in sugar. So the FDA may not provide us with a cutoff for total sugar, but the NIH data does support the idea that whenever sugar intake, that's total sugar intake, is equal to or greater than 20% of the DRI calories, the quality of the nutrition goes down. So we can use that as our cutoff for total sugar. So that means that 0.20 times 2,000 calories, divide that by 4 calories per gram, because of course sugar is a carbohydrate, and we end up with 100 grams being the cutoff for a 2,000 calorie diet. So now if the facts panel indicates that there are 16 grams of total sugar per serving, then we could figure out what the percentage of the DV, and the percent would be 16 grams over the DV of 100 grams times 100, and that would lead us with 16%. So what does 16% mean? Well, if you remember from a few slides previous, that it's between 10 essentially and 19.9. So this means it's moderately high in sugar. Now, if we wanted to be a healthy amount of sugar, acceptable, as in it's not moderately high or high, it would have to be basically greater than 5% all the way up to 9.9% of the DV. Now, it's important to understand here that total sugar is indeed different than added sugar. The total sugar is the sugar content that includes the added sugar as well as the natural sugars found perhaps in fruit, for example. So in a fruit cocktail that's canned, you would have a total sugar that would be different than the added sugar. The total sugar would then be the combination of added sugar that was added into the can by the manufacturer and the sugar naturally found in the actual fruit. So as previously stated, this added sugar is something part of the new nutrition facts panel. So on the left we have the old facts panel, and on the right we have the new facts panel. And you can see that there's some major differences. One of which is that the number of calories are actually highlighted much more on the new facts panel. And also, the serving size is much more visible on the new nutrition facts panel as well. Additionally, if you look closer, for the same number of grams or milligrams, we find that for total fat, the percent of the DV is different in the old facts panel compared to the new facts panel. We see the same difference for total carbohydrates. And we see a difference for dietary fiber. Additionally, the micronutrients featured at the bottom are actually different on the old facts panel compared to the new facts panel. So let's take a closer look. So now a close look at the fat content on the old panel. We see that 8 grams is equal to 12% of the daily value, and now looking at the new panel, that same 8 grams is worth only 10% of the daily value. So on the old facts panel, the daily value for fat was calculated using 30% of the DRI calories for a day, and of course dividing that by 9. And that gave you the daily value on the old nutrition facts panel. That changed over to 35% of the DRI calories. So there was an upward 5% shift in the percent calories coming from fat, still within the healthy range of 20 to 35, but a notable difference nonetheless. So then this means that 30% of the DRI calories on the old facts panel meant that a daily value was 65 grams, and now on the new facts panel, 35% actually means 78 grams of fat. That's the new daily value. This is the one to remember. Now let's take a closer look at the carbohydrates in the new nutrition facts panel. In the old panel, 37 grams of carbohydrate equaled 12% of the daily value, whereas now on the new facts panel, that same value equals 13% of the daily value. So what actually took place? Well, it turns out that the old facts panel relied on 60% of the DRI calories for carbs, and that decreased to 57% of the DRI calories for the new facts panel. So now these new percentages still fall within the normal healthy range of 45 to 65. It's just that now we've gone from 60 to 57%, and thus from 300 grams as an old daily value right down to 285 grams as the new daily value for carbohydrate. So now if we look at fiber on the old facts panel, we can see that 4 grams is actually equal to 16% of the daily value. But on the new facts panel, we can see that that same value is worth only 14% of the daily value. So let's take a closer look and see what actually changed in terms of daily value. So what happened was that on the old facts panel, the daily value for dietary fiber was 25 grams. And in the new facts panel, the daily value went up to 28 grams. So it's very natural then, since the denominator increased from 25 to 28, that the percentage would actually go down. So now this is another item, another daily value to remember, the daily value for fiber, 28 grams. Now the story behind sodium is that on the old facts panel, the daily value for sodium was 2,400 milligrams per day. Currently, the new facts panel uses 2,300 milligrams for the daily value for sodium. Okay then, so let's do the calculation. On the old facts panel, we have 1,060 milligrams of sodium. Divide that by 2,400 and you get 44%. If you take that same value and divide it by 2,300, you get 46% as indicated on the right-hand nutrition facts panel, which is, of course, is the new one. Now I want to turn to the front of different products and to look at the various claims that are made on the cover of food products specifically. So let's look at Honey Nut Cheerio, and let's look at the heart and see what is being claimed here. Can help lower cholesterol. Now it sounds like a health claim, but it's not. It's actually a functional claim. The functional claim is about bringing down the blood cholesterol, so its function is to lower blood cholesterol. It intimates that it might be good for your heart, but it actually isn't calling or naming any particular disease, so therefore it's a functional claim. Let's take a look at old-fashioned oats. The smart for your heart is also a functional claim. Let's also take a look then at the ingredient list specifically. We can see that there is total fat that is 2.5 grams, so it's less than 3. Saturated fat is less than 1. No trans fats. Polyunsaturates, 0 for cholesterol, 0 for sodium. And then we have dietary fiber, which is 4 grams, 16% of the daily value. So it's actually a good source of dietary fiber. So if you look at the total sugar, it's actually 0 grams. So all the criteria that we've seen here actually comes within the guidelines for what the government considers a healthy food. In fact, the total fat's under 3 grams, cholesterol is less than 20, the sodium is less than 140, sugar is at 0, and we also have, as you can see, for fiber, 16% of the daily value, and for iron, 10% of the daily value. So we have at least one nutrient that is providing at least 10% of the daily value, making it a good source for that nutrient. So therefore, because there's really no sugar and there's absolutely no sodium and there's nothing added in, this product is the best cereal on the market. The thing to particularly pay attention to is the ingredient list just right at the bottom, and you can see that it's actually 100% whole grain, and there's nothing else added, no salt, no sugar of any kind. So if rolled oats are the first ideal breakfast cereal for adults and children, what's the second one? Well, probably Fiber One. If you remember, the sodium content was low and there was absolutely no sugar. So this comes in second position. Of course, the fiber is exceedingly high as well. Now, when it comes to products in general, something needs to be said about the ingredient lists specifically. So I'm talking about ingredient lists in general when we talk about products. And the important thing to walk away with here is that ingredients are listed in descending order of weighted importance. In other words, in this example, wheat bran weighs more in content than sugar and more than psyllium. So as we look at this, wheat is first in importance in terms of weight, sugar is in second, psyllium is in third, and salt is actually in fourth, and downward all the way down to BHT for freshness. I want to now address the different types of health claims that could be made on the label of different food products. So now an outright health claim could be made on the label of a food product if it identifies a substance, whether it's a food component, or a dietary ingredient of some kind, and that this ingredient has a direct effect in decreasing the risk of a specifically named disease. So for example, the intake of soluble fiber can help decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease. The intake of insoluble fiber can help decrease the risk of gastrointestinal diseases. These are two very good examples that basically illustrate the specific feature of a health claim. So a health claim is in fact an authoritative statement of a very clear health benefit that has strong scientific backing. In other words, there's a lot of evidence scientifically in the literature that supports the claim that's being advanced. So here's an example of an authoritative health claim. This particular product will help reduce the risk of heart disease. So we have the product named, and we also have a decrease in the risk of an identifiable disease, notably heart disease. And this kind of claim can only be made on a label if there is authoritative research, significant research, and commonly accepted research, if you will, that supports the finding. In previous slides, we saw examples of a content claim. It has on the label the content of a nutrient nicely featured with no link to any kind of disease, right? And no link to any structure or function claim as well. It simply states that the product is high in folate, for example. Here's an example of a label that contains a content claim. It only states here that there's a lot of fiber. How much? 65% of the daily value. The next kind of claim is called the structure function claim. It describes a function, not a disease, not an improvement in disease. It will actually improve the immunity, for example, or it will strengthen the bones, or it will provide gastrointestinal health. But note that it's not tying itself with any kind of disease condition, and that's one of the requirements for a structure function claim. Here's an example of a structure function claim. This label says will help strengthen your body's defense system. So it's not naming any kind of disease. It's not promising the reduction of risk of disease. It's simply saying that it's going to change the function, if you will, or strengthen the function of the immune system. This is a good example of a structure function claim. Here are a few more examples of structure function claims. For example, a food may help to strengthen bones. Doesn't state a disease specifically, doesn't state osteoporosis, doesn't state rickets. It just talks about the strengthening of the structure of the bone. Help reduce cholesterol. Well, that's actually a function. It will reduce the cholesterol, but it doesn't say it's going to reduce heart disease, right? And so that's why it gets the structure function claim. It may actually help boost the immunity. Well, that's just really a function of the body that gets helped, but it doesn't talk about any immunological disease specifically. So this is why these are good examples of structure function claims. And finally, there's the qualified health claim. This is a health claim with a qualifying statement. And the statement indicates that the evidence supporting the claim is limited. It generally means that there's no real consensus among the scientific community supporting the particular health benefit. Here's an example of a qualified health claim. Olive oil for your heart, and the FDA's disclaimer, qualified health claim for coronary artery disease risk reduction. So it's basically saying, consumer beware, the relationship between heart disease and actual olive oil is weak. There's no strong consensus.